The busy airport terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of a Friday afternoon. People rushed in all directions, dragging suitcases behind them while staring at their phones. Among the crowd stood a small boy, about 8 years old, clutching a worn space book to his chest. His bright eyes darted around excitedly, taking in everything around him. "Ready for our adventure, Tommy?" asked his nanny, Ms. Patel, a kind-faced woman in her 30s who had been with the family for nearly 4 years. She adjusted the backpack on her shoulder while keeping a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. Tommy nodded eagerly, bouncing slightly on his toes. "Do you think Dad will like the drawings I made of the solar system? I worked really hard on Jupiter's storms." "He's going to love them," Ms. Patel assured him with a warm smile. "Your dad told me he can't wait to hear all about what you've been learning." They made their way to the boarding area, Tommy chattering the whole time about black holes and space stations. It had been 2 weeks since he'd seen his father, and the boy had a notebook full of questions saved up. His dad had promised to take him to the Space Museum when they arrived in Chicago if the weather was good. When their boarding group was called, Tommy clutched his book tighter. Flying made him a little nervous, but his excitement about seeing his dad overshadowed any fear. Ms. Patel helped him with his small carry-on bag as they moved through the gate. "Remember what your dad taught you about airplanes?" she asked, noticing his nervous glance at the jet bridge. Tommy's face lit up. "The bumpy parts are just like driving on a dirt road, and the loud noises are just the plane's way of talking." "Exactly right," she said, giving his shoulder a gentle squeeze. They boarded the plane and found their seats in the Economy Plus section. 14A and 14B. Tommy immediately claimed the window seat, pressing his nose against the glass to watch the ground crew load luggage into the belly of the aircraft. "Look, that guy has a glowing stick thing like in Star Wars," he exclaimed, pointing at a ground worker directing a baggage cart with illuminated battens. Ms. Patel smiled as she stored their bags in the overhead compartment. She'd paid extra from her own pocket to upgrade their seats, knowing how much Tommy loved looking out the window during flights. His father had offered to put them in first class with him, but he had an important business call scheduled during the flight, and Ms. Patel thought Tommy might get restless having to stay quiet for so long. As more passengers filed onto the plane, Tommy pulled out his spacebook and flipped to a dog-eared page showing the rings of Saturn. "Did you know," he said, not looking up, "that Saturn's rings are made of billions of ice chunks and rocks? Some are as tiny as dust and some are as big as houses." "I didn't know the big ones were house-sized," Ms. Patel replied, genuinely interested. Tommy had a gift for remembering facts about things that fascinated him. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, checking seatbelts and overhead bins. Tommy carefully placed his book in the seat pocket and fastened his seatbelt without being reminded. He'd been flying since he was a toddler and knew the routine well. "Dad said he has a surprise for me," Tommy whispered, his eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Do you know what it is?" Ms. Patel shook her head. "He wouldn't tell me either. Must be something really special." Tommy grinned and turned back to the window. The plane was almost full now, with just a few passengers still finding their seats. He pulled out a small notebook from his pocket and uncapped a pen, ready to jot down any interesting cloud formations he might see during takeoff. His dad had taught him how to identify different types of clouds, and they had a game where they tried to spot the rarest ones. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard the flight to Chicago. Tommy straightened in his seat, excitement building. In just a few hours, he would be with his dad again, ready to share all his new space knowledge and cloud observations. Little did he know that their journey was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would teach him more about human nature than any book ever could. Tommy was just settling into his window seat, pointing out different airport vehicles to Ms. Patel, when a sharp voice cut through their conversation. "Excuse me, excuse me." A woman in her mid-50s with an expensive-looking handbag and perfectly styled blonde hair was standing in the aisle, staring at the seat assignment on her boarding pass and then at the row number above Tommy's head. Her lips were pinched together in a tight line as she looked back and forth between the paper and the seats. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" asked Ms. Patel politely. The woman ignored her completely, instead flagging down a passing flight attendant. "Excuse me, I think there's been some mistake with my seating arrangement," she said loudly enough for several rows to hear. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Mr. Chen, smiled professionally. What seems to be the issue? I paid extra for Economy Plus, the woman said, gesturing at her boarding pass. And it says I'm in 14C, but she glanced at Tommy, who was watching the exchange with curious eyes, then lowered her voice slightly, though not enough to prevent others from hearing. Isn't there somewhere else I could sit, perhaps next to different people? Mr. Chen's smile remained fixed, but his eyes cooled noticeably. I'm sorry, ma'am, but the flight is fully booked today. All passengers must sit in their assigned seats. But surely you can understand my concern, the woman persisted, her voice taking on an entitled edge. I paid good money for these seats and I expected a certain quality of experience. Tommy shrank back against the window, suddenly feeling like he had done something wrong without knowing what. Ms. Patel's hand found his shoulder and squeezed reassuringly. Ma'am, Mr. Chen said, his voice firmer now, Economy Plus refers to the extra legroom and seat recline, not to who sits next to you. Your assigned seat is 14C, right here. He pointed to the aisle seat in their row. The woman's face flushed red. I can see that, she snapped. But look around. There must be other options. She leaned closer to the flight attendant and whispered something, gesturing discreetly toward Tommy. A couple sitting across the aisle exchanged uncomfortable glances. Behind them, a man with glasses lowered his newspaper, frowning at the unfolding scene. The plane had gone quieter, with several nearby passengers now openly listening to the exchange. I don't understand, Tommy whispered to Ms. Patel. Did I do something wrong? No, sweetheart, Ms. Patel assured him quietly. You've done absolutely nothing wrong. Some people just have unkind hearts. The woman overheard this and scoffed. Oh, please, this isn't about being unkind. It's about getting what I paid for. She turned back to Mr. Chen. Look, I'm a Silver Elite member with this airline. Surely that counts for something. Ma'am, Mr. Chen replied, his patience visibly thinning. Your membership status is appreciated, but it doesn't entitle you to choose your seatmates based on. He paused meaningfully, personal preferences. Now, I need to ask you to take your assigned seat, or I'll have to call the head flight attendant. Other passengers were now openly staring. An elderly woman across the aisle shook her head disapprovingly at the entitled passenger. A young couple a few rows ahead had turned around completely to watch the scene unfold. This is ridiculous, the woman muttered, but she reluctantly began to put her handbag in the overhead bin. I've never been treated this way before. I'll be writing to customer service about this. As she finally took her seat beside Ms. Patel, she made a show of shifting as far away from them as possible, practically pressing herself against the armrest of the aisle seat. She pulled out her phone and began typing furiously, presumably composing an angry email or social media post. Tommy looked down at his spacebook, no longer excited to share facts about planets or point out interesting things outside the window. His small shoulders hunched forward as if trying to make himself even smaller. Ms. Patel leaned over and whispered, Hey, want to see something cool? I packed your favorite cookies in my bag for when we're in the air. Tommy gave her a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. The joy that had filled him just minutes ago had dimmed considerably. He glanced nervously at the woman beside them, who was still muttering under her breath about standards and customer rights. What had started as an exciting journey to see his father was now clouded by tension and confusion. Tommy didn't fully understand what was happening, but he could feel the weight of the woman's disapproval pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. Little did anyone know, the situation was about to take an even more dramatic turn. The tension in row 14 was thick enough to cut with a knife. The woman, who had reluctantly taken her seat, continued to make her displeasure known through loud sighs and dramatic eye rolls. She had pulled out a travel-sized bottle of hand sanitizer and was ostentatiously rubbing it between her palms every few minutes, making sure that everyone nearby noticed. Tommy sat quietly by the window, his spacebook open but forgotten on his lap. The excitement that had been bubbling inside him earlier had faded, replaced by a knot in his stomach. He didn't understand exactly what was happening, but he knew it had something to do with him, and that knowledge hurt more than any scraped knee ever could. Ms. Patel noticed his downcast eyes and leaned closer. Hey, why don't you tell me more about those Jupiter storms you were drawing? The ones with the swirly patterns. Before Tommy could answer, the woman beside them scoffed loudly. "Do you mind? Some of us are trying to prepare for an important business meeting." She held up her phone as if it were proof. Ms. Patel straightened in her seat, something shifting in her usually gentle expression. "Actually, I do mind," she said in a quiet but firm voice. "Tommy and I were having a perfectly pleasant conversation before you arrived, and we have every right to continue it." The woman's eyebrows shot up. "Excuse me. I was simply asking for some peace and quiet, which isn't unreasonable on a 3-hour flight." "No, what you're doing isn't reasonable at all," Ms. Patel replied, keeping her voice calm but resolute. "What you're doing is making a child feel unwelcome and uncomfortable for no good reason." A few passengers nearby had turned to watch this new development. An older man across the aisle nodded in approval at Ms. Patel's words. "I don't have to justify myself to you," the woman snapped, her cheeks flushing with anger. "This is about common courtesy. I paid extra for these seats expecting a certain level off." "What you expected," Ms. Patel interrupted, "was to not sit next to someone who looks like Tommy. Let's be honest about what's really happening here." The woman gasped, placing a hand over her chest in exaggerated shock. "How dare you accuse me of what?" Ms. Patel challenged. "Go ahead and say it. What exactly is your problem with sitting next to us?" Mr. Chen, who had been helping other passengers, noticed the escalating situation and quickly made his way back to their row. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, though his expression made it clear he knew it wasn't. "No, everything is not all right," the woman said, seizing the opportunity. "This person is harassing me and making wild accusations." Mr. Chen turned to Ms. Patel with a questioning look. "I'm simply defending Tommy," Ms. Patel explained calmly. "This woman has been making thinly veiled comments since she arrived and is clearly unhappy about sitting next to him based solely on his appearance." The woman spluttered, "That's absolutely not true. I never said anything about—" "You didn't have to say it explicitly," came a new voice. The businessman seated behind them had leaned forward. "We all heard what you were implying. I've been traveling for 30 years, and I know perfectly well what quality of experience means in this context." Several other passengers murmured in agreement. The woman looked around, suddenly realizing she had no allies in this situation. Mr. Chen cleared his throat. "Ma'am, on this airline, we have a strict policy against discriminatory behavior of any kind. If you're uncomfortable in your assigned seat, I can see if we have any available seats at the back of the aircraft." The implied demotion from economy plus to regular economy was not lost on anyone. A few passengers even smiled slightly at the suggestion. "This is outrageous," the woman sputtered. "I'm a paying customer." "So are we," Ms. Patel pointed out quietly. Tommy, who had been watching this exchange with wide eyes, suddenly spoke up. "It's okay, Ms. Patel. Dad says that sometimes people are mean because they don't know any better." The simple wisdom from the 8-year-old's mouth caused a moment of surprised silence. Even the angry woman seemed taken aback. Mr. Chen smiled at Tommy. "That's very understanding of you, young man. But on this flight, we expect all our passengers to treat each other with respect." He turned back to the woman. "So, would you like me to find you another seat, or can you follow our young passenger's example and show some basic decency?" The woman clutched her handbag tighter, clearly torn between her prejudice and the public embarrassment of being moved to the back of the plane. Before she could answer, another flight attendant appeared at the end of their row, looking slightly flustered. "Mr. Chen, there's a passenger from first class asking to speak with you. He says it's regarding a situation in row 14. Tommy's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. The confrontation was about to take an unexpected turn. All eyes turned toward the front of the plane as a tall man in a perfectly tailored navy suit made his way down the aisle. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone used to commanding attention without having to ask for it. His tie was slightly loosened at the neck, the only hint that he might have been in a rush. The woman who had been causing all the trouble suddenly sat up straighter, smoothing her blouse and fixing her hair. Her entire demeanor shifted as she recognized the approaching figure. Several other passengers were whispering now, a few even pulling out phones to take discreet photos. Tommy's face, which had been clouded with confusion and hurt just moments before, suddenly lit up like a Christmas tree. He pressed his small hands against the window seat tray table, barely containing himself from jumping up. Mr. Chen stepped aside respectfully as the men reached their row. "Dr. Wilson, thank you for your patience. As I mentioned, we have a situation." "I understand," the man said, his voice deep and measured. He glanced at the flight attendant's name tag. "Thank you, Mr. Chen. I'd like a moment here, if that's all right." The doctor's eyes swept over the scene, the flustered woman clutching her designer handbag, Ms. Patel's protective posture, and finally landing on Tommy, who was now practically vibrating with excitement. "Hello there," Dr. Wilson said, his serious expression softening as he looked at the boy. "You came?" Tommy exclaimed, his voice filled with pure joy. "I knew you would." The doctor smiled, the kind of smile that transformed his whole face from distinguished professional to something much warmer. "Of course I did. I heard there might be a problem back here." He knelt down in the aisle so he was at eye level with Tommy, seeming completely unconcerned about wrinkling his expensive suit. "You okay, buddy?" The woman's mouth had fallen slightly open, her eyes darting between Tommy and the doctor with growing confusion and alarm. "I'm okay now," Tommy said, his earlier hurt momentarily forgotten. "But that lady doesn't want to sit by me." He lowered his voice to a whisper that was still audible to everyone nearby. "I think it's because of my skin." A ripple of discomfort passed through the nearby passengers. The raw honesty of a child laying bare what adults had been dancing around hit hard. Dr. Wilson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained gentle as he addressed Tommy. "Well, that would be her loss, wouldn't it? Because I happen to know you're the best seatmate on this entire plane." He reached out and straightened the collar of Tommy's shirt with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 100 times before. After all, who else knows all the planets in order and can spot 5 different types of clouds? The woman had gone completely still, her face draining of color as realization began to dawn. "Excuse me," she finally managed to stammer, leaning forward slightly. "But do you two know each other?" Dr. Wilson stood up slowly, turning to face her with an expression that was perfectly polite yet somehow icy. "Yes, we do. Quite well, in fact." He extended his hand formally. "Dr. Anthony Wilson, Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery at Cleveland Memorial." The woman took his hand automatically, her movements stiff with shock. "And this," Dr. Wilson continued, placing his other hand gently on Tommy's shoulder, "is my son, Thomas Wilson, Jr." The effect of those 6 simple words was immediate. The woman's face cycled through a series of expressions: disbelief, embarrassment, horror, and finally mortification. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. Around them, several passengers exchanged knowing looks. An older woman across the aisle didn't bother hiding her satisfied smile. The businessman who had spoken up earlier nodded approvingly. "Your son?" The woman finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, my son," Dr. Wilson confirmed, his tone making it clear the facts should never have mattered in the first place. "Now, I understand there's been some sort of issue regarding seating arrangements." The tension in the cabin was thick enough to touch. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The woman squirmed in her seat, trapped between her earlier behavior and the unexpected turn of events. Tommy looked up at his father with complete trust, unaware of just how dramatically the power dynamic had shifted. For him, his dad had simply shown up when he needed him, just like always. But for everyone else watching, this was the moment a bully was about to face consequences she never saw coming. The woman's face had turned a deep shade of red that spread all the way to her neck. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her designer handbag, suddenly looking very small in her seat. The awkward silence stretched for what felt like forever before she finally found her voice. There's been a misunderstanding," she stammered, attempting to regain her composure. "I never meant to imply. It wasn't about. I just prefer aisle seats, that's all." Dr. Wilson raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Because from what I understand, you specifically requested to be moved away from my son. Not away from the window, not to an aisle seat, but away from him." The woman fidgeted with her pearl necklace. No. Your son seems like a lovely boy." "I would never. It's just that I have business materials to review and children can be distracting." A passenger across the aisle snorted. That's not what you were saying earlier. Dr. Wilson turned to Ms. Patel, who had been watching the interaction with quiet satisfaction. Can you tell me what happened exactly? Before Ms. Patel could answer, Tommy tugged at his father's sleeve. Dad, she didn't want to sit by us. She kept using her hand cleaner thing and making faces like this. Tommy scrunched up his nose and twisted his mouth into an exaggerated grimace that would have been funny in any other context. The simplicity and honesty of a child cut through all the adult pretense. Several passengers nodded in agreement with Tommy's assessment. Dr. Wilson considered his son's words, then turned back to the woman. I see. And do you always sanitize your hands repeatedly when seated next to children, or was there something specific about my son that triggered this behavior? The woman opened her mouth, then closed it. There was no good answer. I think we both know what this is really about, Dr. Wilson continued, his voice calm but firm. And I want you to understand something very important. He paused, making sure he had her full attention. My son deserves respect and dignity regardless of who his father is or what seat he's sitting in. Tommy watched his father with wide eyes, absorbing every word. The color of his skin doesn't make him less deserving of basic human kindness, Dr. Wilson continued. The fact that you're only uncomfortable now because you've discovered his father is a doctor says everything about your character and nothing about his worth. The plane had gone completely silent. Even passengers from several rows away were leaning into the aisle to witness the confrontation. The woman seemed to shrink with each word. I never said anything about race, she protested weakly. You didn't have to, Mr. Chen said, who had returned to the row. Actions speak louder than words. Dr. Wilson nodded in agreement. I could request that you be removed from this flight for your behavior, but I think there's a more valuable lesson here. He glanced at Tommy, then back at the woman. My son is watching. He's learning how to respond when faced with prejudice and ignorance. I could show him that anger is the answer, but instead, I want him to see that education and dignity are more powerful tools. The woman stared down at her lap, unable to meet his gaze. So you have a choice, Dr. Wilson continued. You can either take this as a moment to reflect on your biases and perhaps grow as a person, or you can continue to live in your bubble of ignorance. Either way, you will not make my son feel unwelcome or inferior. Not today. Not ever. Tommy beamed up at his father with pride and adoration. A smattering of applause broke out among the nearby passengers. The businessman behind them nodded his approval. An elderly woman across the aisle wiped a tear from her eye. Mr. Chen cleared his throat. Ma'am, we do have one seat available at the back of the plane if you prefer to move. The woman looked around at the judgmental faces surrounding her. She had never felt more exposed or ashamed in her life. Whatever business meeting she was heading to suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the very public moral reckoning she was experiencing. She had a decision to make, and every person on that plane was waiting to see what kind of person she truly was. Time seemed to stand still as everyone on the plane waited for the woman's response. Her fingers nervously twisted the strap of her expensive handbag, and a thin sheen of sweat had formed on her forehead despite the cool air blowing from the vents above. She began, then stopped, clearly struggling with what to say next. Her eyes darted around, searching for any sympathetic face among the passengers, but finding none. I think I'll stay here, she finally said, her voice barely audible. Mr. Chen nodded curtly. Very well. The flight will be departing shortly. Everyone, please make sure your seatbelts are fastened. He gave Dr. Wilson a respectful nod before moving on to check the rest of the cabin. Dr. Wilson knelt down beside Tommy's seat again. I need to go back to my seat for takeoff, buddy. Will you be okay? Tommy nodded, his eyes bright with admiration for his father. I'm okay, Dad. I have my space book, and Miss Patel is here too. Dr. Wilson smiled and ruffled his son's hair gently. That's my brave boy. I'll come check on you once we're in the air. He stood up and fixed the woman with one last meaningful look. I trust there won't be any further issues. It wasn't a question, and everyone knew it. The woman gave a small, tight nod, her eyes fixed firmly on her lap. As Dr. Wilson made his way back to first class, passengers smiled and nodded at him. An older gentleman even reached out to pat his arm in approval as he passed. Once he was gone, an uncomfortable silence fell over row 14. Tommy reopened his spacebook, finding comfort in the familiar pictures of planets and stars. Ms. Patel sat protectively beside him, occasionally shooting warning glances at the woman, who seemed determined to make herself as small as possible in her seat. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now third in line for takeoff," the captain's voice announced over the intercom. "Flight attendants, please prepare for departure." As the plane began to taxi, Tommy pressed his face against the window, his earlier excitement returning as he watched the ground crew wave their light sticks. Ms. Patel smiled, relieved to see him bouncing back from the unpleasant encounter. The woman beside them sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead. The public humiliation she had experienced seemed to have knocked the entitlement right out of her. Occasionally, she would glance sideways at Tommy, her expression unreadable. The plane accelerated down the runway, and Tommy grinned as they lifted off the ground. "Look, Ms. Patel, we're flying." "We sure are," Ms. Patel agreed warmly. "And look at those clouds. Can you identify them?" Tommy squinted through the window. "Those are cumulus clouds. Dad taught me that ones that look like cotton balls are cumulus." "Very good," Ms. Patel praised. "Your dad will be impressed when you tell him." At the mention of Dr. Wilson, the woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She cleared her throat softly, drawing both Tommy and Ms. Patel's attention. That's correct about the clouds," she said awkwardly. "My father was a meteorologist. He taught me about clouds when I was a girl." Tommy looked at her with surprise, unsure how to respond to this sudden attempt at conversation. Ms. Patel's eyebrows rose slightly, but she remained silent, waiting to see where this might go. The woman continued haltingly, "I have a book about weather in my bag. It has some nice pictures of different cloud formations. Would you like to see it?" The offer hung in the air between them, clumsy but seemingly genuine. Tommy looked to Ms. Patel for guidance, his young face showing confusion. Was this the same woman who had been so mean just minutes ago? Ms. Patel gave him a small nod, her expression cautious but not discouraging. "Okay," Tommy said simply. "I like books with pictures." The woman reached for her bag with trembling hands, as if this small interaction was taking every ounce of courage she possessed. As she pulled out a well-worn book with a blue cover, something in her face had changed. The hard, judgmental lines had softened, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. Whether this was a genuine change of heart or merely an attempt to save face remained to be seen. But as the plane climbed higher into the sky, leaving the ground far below, it seemed that something significant had shifted in row 14. The plane had been in the air for about 30 minutes when Dr. Wilson made his way back from first class. He paused in the aisle, surprised by the scene before him. Tommy and the woman were huddled over her weather book, with Tommy pointing excitedly at a page showing different types of lightning. "That one's called sheep lightning," Tommy was saying. "It lights up the whole sky." The woman nodded. "That's right. And this one here is called a bolt from the blue. It's dangerous because it can strike up to 10 miles away from the actual storm." Dr. Wilson exchanged glances with Ms. Patel, who gave him a small shrug and a cautious smile. "Dad," Tommy exclaimed when he noticed his father, "Mrs. Baker has a really cool book about weather. Did you know there are clouds that look like waves?" "Lenticular clouds," Dr. Wilson said with a smile. "I've seen them over mountains." He studied the woman, Mrs. Baker, with curiosity. She met his gaze briefly before looking away. We were just looking at some cloud formations," she explained awkwardly. "Your son is very knowledgeable for his age." "He takes after his mother," Dr. Wilson said, his voice softening at the mention of his wife. She was a science teacher. "Was?" Mrs. Baker asked before she could stop herself. A shadow passed over Dr. Wilson's face. "She passed away 3 years ago. Cancer." Mrs. Baker's hand flew to her mouth. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, and for the first time since boarding the plane, her words seemed completely genuine. Tommy reached for his father's hand. "Mom loved clouds too. She said they were like nature's paintings." Dr. Wilson squeezed his son's hand. "That's right, buddy. She did say that." An uncomfortable silence fell over them, heavy with unspoken words and emotions. Mrs. Baker fidgeted with the corner of her book, clearly struggling internally. Dr. Wilson, she finally said, her voice barely audible above the hum of the airplane engines. I owe you and your son an apology. She took a deep breath. What I did, how I behaved earlier, there's no excuse. I was wrong. Dr. Wilson's expression remained neutral, waiting. The truth is, she continued, her voice shaking slightly, I was raised with certain beliefs. My parents, my community. She stopped herself. But that's not an excuse. I'm a grown woman. I should know better. She turned to Tommy. Especially when it means hurting someone who's done nothing wrong. I'm truly sorry. Tommy blinked at her, processing her words with the straightforward logic of a child. Does that mean you don't think my skin is bad anymore? The blunt question made Mrs. Baker flinch. No, honey, your skin isn't bad. It never was. The problem was in my thinking, not in you. A few nearby passengers who had been subtly eavesdropping exchanged approving glances. Dr. Wilson studied Mrs. Baker's face carefully, searching for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, he nodded slowly. Recognizing you were wrong is the first step, but real change takes work. I know, she said quietly. This experience, it's forced me to see myself in a way I never wanted to. I don't like what I saw. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing they would be landing in Chicago in about 20 minutes. Tommy bounced excitedly in his seat. Dad, can we still go to the Space Museum? You promised. Dr. Wilson smiled. Yes, we can. And maybe we can find a book about lenticular clouds while we're there. As the plane began its descent, Mrs. Baker closed her weather book and handed it to Tommy. You should keep this. It sounds like you'd appreciate it more than I would. Tommy's eyes widened. Really? Are you sure? She nodded. Consider it a peace offering. And maybe? She glanced at Dr. Wilson. A reminder that people can change, even when they start from a bad place. Dr. Wilson considered this, then gave a small nod. Tommy, what do we say when someone gives us a gift? Thank you, Mrs. Baker, Tommy said politely, clutching the book to his chest. As the plane touched down on the runway, the sun broke through the clouds outside, sending streaks of light through the cabin windows. In row 14, an unlikely lesson had unfolded, one about prejudice and forgiveness, about the wisdom of children and the capacity for adults to learn from their mistakes. It wasn't a perfect ending. Real change would take time. But as they prepared to disembark, there was a sense that something meaningful had happened, a small but significant shift in understanding that would ripple outward in ways none of them could yet imagine.